Good evening. It's 6 o'clock in the UK here, and welcome to Monday's edition of the Daily Objective. I'm delighted to be joined today by Mark Pellegrino, and we're going to be discussing today bullying and in the context of online bullying. And it's funny that this subject came up, Mark, because I work as a psychologist and I do a lot of clinical work. And on Friday, I was working through some trauma memories with a client, and they're of the generation, they're probably 10, 15 years younger than me. They're probably in their mid-20s. And they were talking about, they were sort of relaying this horrific experience of online bullying via Facebook in kind of the earlier days of Facebook when they were about 11 or 12. And they were telling me that it had accelerated from sort of, oh, you're a sad loser kind of rhetoric to escalating very quickly to, we want you to die and don't ever come back to school. And the impact of that on a young person, I think, must be brutal. And it really struck me. And then Razi asked us if we could do a subject on this tonight, and I was just wondering what even me just telling you that tale, it's not a tale, it's a true event, is bringing up for you, because I know you're very interested in this subject.
Well, it's troubling that it seems like people are so willing to harm another person like that, and that it's becoming a bit of an epidemic issue. I've experienced a very similar sort of gang pile on me, and I'd like to ask you, what do you think is responsible for this kind of disconnect between human beings, where one side is so utterly unempathetic towards the other, where there's no desire to build a bridge with another human being, but to burn one down, even in kids, not just adults with political differences and spiritual differences, but kids. What do you think is the cause of this epidemic viciousness?
Well, I think there's a few things going on. I think with kids, it's a lot of it is actually learning boundaries, because I've worked with a lot of people who will say, you know what, I was a bit of a bully when I was younger, and I take responsibility for that, but I didn't realize, I had no idea of the consequence and the context of what those things mean and did to someone. And I think in the same way that shame is a very useful emotion in the way it changes and alters behavior in particularly in very young children. I think you're getting something similar to that with kind of adolescence, and they're pushing boundaries, and some are taking it too far. And I think the problem with online is you don't see the reaction. When you tease someone in the playground, you see someone's upset, and I remember a lot of kids would push, and then suddenly go, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize that I'd done that, and that you're upset. And I think it's when you've got this sort of social online way of interacting, there's that element of not getting immediate feedback about what's going on, and pushing it. And of course, a lot of people young kids aren't going to respond. So it just escalates, because a bully will always push till they get a response, usually. So I think you've got an element of that. I think when you're talking about adults doing it, I think it's a very vicious form of virtue signaling. People pile on, but they always make sure that in the pile-in, everyone else can see that they're doing it too. And I think politically, and you see this a lot on Twitter, and this goes way back, it's not, it's always been this going on, is that more people, particularly tribalists, collectivists, particularly on the left traditionally, believe that the end justifies the means. So if I'm going to take you down, and I'm going to take you down any way I can, if I take you down, I'm virtuous. And I think you've got a lot of those things all at play. And so I think it's important to separate out what's going on with kids than what's going on with adults. And I think adults should know much better than what they're doing now. And
No, I think you're right. I think kids are experimenting with boundaries and pushing boundaries, and the way they figure out what those boundaries are by reactions and responses that push back. They need resistance in order to understand how far they can go, and that resistance isn't there online. And in the playground, it is. I mean, just thinking about my own childhood, most of the kids in my school came from broken homes and very unhappy families. This is the early 70s when parenting was a very different phenomenon than it is today. We were essentially on our own. And there wasn't a day that went by that we weren't beating the crap out of each other or exchanging positions where one was a bully and one was the victim, and one was the victim, one was the bully. Every week, these roles were switched around by us, and we learned our boundaries by the punch in the face.
Mm.
You know, when you by seeing that we couldn't press a person past a certain point because there were these consequences, and that's missing online. And I do agree with you that adults, it's the adults that think they can vote virtue in, or that they could fulfill their moral ideal by voting the right candidate, and that seem to fall into these tribalistic modes. Don't you think? They
Totally.
don't, right? They don't. It's not, virtue isn't about acting to produce the values that you want in your own life. It's about reforming the world by power elements and putting the right elites in the right places so that you get the results that you want. I find those people are more apt to virtue signal than somebody who thinks their life is their own responsibility. Don't you?
No, definitely, and I think ultimately what we're dealing with here and looking at here is very low self-esteem. So
Mm.
traditionally, a bully has low self-esteem and needs to feel better than someone else by it's all otherism. So at school, I'll put down the kid to make myself feel a little bit better, and any form of self-esteem that's generated through others, you may get a little like we technically a little dopamine hit from the recognition of someone else. You know, the kid who puts their hand up in class all the time to get they know the answer and they feel good every time they get the little well done for getting that. But it ultimately just leads to really low self-esteem. And I think it's just so obvious to me when you see this happening, particularly in adults, with the bullying and the cancel culture and all these types of behavior. It's a very low self-esteem and trying to make people desperately trying to make themselves feel better by getting recognition from their mostly from their tribe. And the problem with that is you get diminishing returns every time. So you have to push it harder and you have to push it harder and you have to push it harder. So calling someone a Nazi might have made you feel a bit better one day, but a couple of weeks later, you're going to have to topple a statue to get the same kind of very transient feeling because it's not rooted in anything in self. And
Do you think that since it's to us objectivists, self-esteem is linked to reality? It's linked to a recognition that you are efficacious, right?
yeah,
That you can achieve things in the world. Increasingly, probably from the beginning, morality has sort of been uncoupled from reality. And do you think that's the reason for this massive epidemic in no self-esteem? Because morality is uncoupled from reality, self-esteem is uncoupled from it, right? So
I,
they don't link self-esteem to achievement and goodness and virtue. They link it to something else.
so I think you've definitely got the philosophical elements of that, like exactly as you're describing there, and then you've got the psychological elements as well. And this is one of the genius of Rand was when she identified self-esteem having two questions. It asked two questions. And when I reflect these two questions with clients and in groups and things, it blows people's minds. It seems people are like, oh, I get it now. And self-esteem just asks two questions. Am I able, like you were just saying there? And then the more complicated and darker question for a lot of people, am I worthy? And
Mm.
it's the worthiness element that I find people struggle with the most. And that can explain why so often I'll see someone who is CEO of a company, but yet they've got really low self-esteem. They're incredibly able, but they don't have any worth. They feel, and you'll probably relate to this, many people who feel guilty for being successful because they have an ethics that tells them that they should give it all away and that they shouldn't, tall poppy syndrome and all these elements that go on. And, am I worthy really ties more into either philosophical, what you've been brought up with, the culture of, you mustn't be too big-headed and you mustn't show off and all those things, and when you're a kid that translate into behavior in later life. But also there's am I worthy can also really tie into trauma. So you're talking about earlier about growing up in rough times, rough neighborhood. A lot of kids really are deeply traumatized. And I wrote about this quite a lot in the OAC last year as an interesting line between what is abuse, because the objectivist politics tells us that we can only infringe rights with physical force, but there are definitely some elements of upbringing that cross that line, and I've seen a lot of kids really lose their sense of worth due to very poor parenting. And so an element of very poor parenting coupled with a bad philosophy will lead to, I'm afraid, a lot of these people running around like headless chickens, screaming at everyone and trying to smash everyone else to make themselves feel better.
What do you think about what do you think about the role of radical skepticism in causing this issue, this self-esteem problem? Because it's my view that radical skepticism sort of is controlling the argument right now. I see it in television shows saturating our culture, and when you're a radical skeptic, you don't believe in the efficacy of your own mind. You don't think that reality is knowable. What does that produce? I can't see anything but chronic anxiety from that point of view.
What I notice more with the nihilists and the skeptics, I notice more depression. So just apathy, and it just, what's the point in doing life? Mm-hmm. There's no even sense of cause. So the people who are more skeptical aren't even going to join Black Lives Matters march or things like that. They're just like, what is the point in anything? And we can't know anything anyway. And how do I even know who I am? And they often end up that schism leaves them just in bed and not really doing anything. And I've worked with a lot of people like that. So I think that skepticism you're talking about leads more to real chronic deep depression, because depression ultimately, aside from your kind of what we call and there's not really a huge amount of research on this, but biological depression caused by either chemical imbalances in the brain, particularly sort of bipolar disorders, or problems with your I'm having a complete mind blank right now. Anyway, it's
serotonin levels.
Yeah, no, it's not that, but that's more but most depression is generated from the way you think and your belief systems.
Right.
And most depression is ultimately comes down to believing either that you're self-defective, and that's more the trauma angle, or you're helpless. I have no control. I have no efficacy. I have no free will. Nothing I do makes any difference. And I find those people just become completely ineffective. They kind of give up.
Well, those seem to be the consistent skeptics, but then there are those who are higher up in the academic food chain who sell skepticism and radical skepticism, but try to convince others that it's so. And they are militant in their attempt to convince others that it's so, and they're activists in their attempt to convince others it's so. It's like, it seems to me that much of the activism today is sort of rooted in a type of skepticism and moral relativism, which should be self-detonating on its face, but somehow these people are nonetheless pressed forward to make it a cause du jour. You see, right? Yeah. They're militant about their skepticism, and they want you to adopt it as well because it's the sophisticated way of looking at the world. Now, what is it about those people that makes them militant as opposed to the person who takes the ideas seriously and just goes to sleep?
I think it's cognitive dissonance. There's something that Dr. Yaron Brook spoke about one time. He talked about people going to their philosophy classes, being told that their senses don't work, are invalid, that you can't know anything. He says these same professors then go outside the classroom use their senses to cross the road and drive home safely. You know, and they have a sort of a level and an ability to sort of split themselves off in the same way that no one can truly be altruistic. You get people who will be altruistic in certain areas of their life, and then they will, you know, live their own life on the side, and they'll feel guilty about it. And I think your high level professors are able to do that. I think they have an ability to do that. To, you know, it's a bit like a bit like dissociation. They're able to just it's a bit like multiple personality disorder. Yeah, they're able to split themselves off. And I also wonder how many of them actually believe it. I don't know. You know, the more I speak with someone like Harry Binswanger and listen to him, he talks more and more and more about most people actually believe the things that they're saying. And he's got a lot more experience of life than philosophy professors and things than I do, because there's a large part of me that's wondering how much do these people actually believe what they preach, or do they preach it because they think they should preach it, or do they preach it because it just gave them some angle or it makes their life easier? I don't know yet.
I mean, it seems like it would seem to me that a professor is doing more than compartmentalizing. He's making something more important than the truth. And it's a destructive thing that he's making more important than the truth. So this is just sort of a felt sense at the moment, but I can't help but think that professor is intentionally trying to dissemble. His pride, his joy is in the deconstruction of someone's psyche, as opposed to the building of somebody, and what happens from the deconstruction, which is dependency and insecurity. I think it somehow aggrandizes him. It makes him an elite, right? He's the one who's supplying the answers to the people who can't get them.
Yeah. Well, that's the Ellsworth Toohey approach. And I think Rand slightly revised her opinion on whether the Tooheys actually exist or not. You know, and slightly changed what she saw as evil in Atlas Shrugged as more kind of, you know, your villains in Atlas Shrugged were much less efficacious than Toohey was in The Fountainhead, and much more muddled and much more disconnected from reality. And you know, I still think Toohey is one of the greatest characters in all of Rand's fiction, but in many ways maybe slightly the not quite as real as the other ones. And I'm not sure how many professors are Toohey-esque or not. I think some of them. I think maybe your Trotskys and people probably were, but I think a lot of, I mean, I don't know if I've met a lot of these professors. They played the game throughout, you know, they played the game. They weren't particularly bright or anything. I find it's just that, you know, they played a certain game and played the right politics to get up to where they got to. I don't think there was much independent thinking. But I'm not hugely well versed in all of this, but that's just my current observations. And I'm wondering what you make of that.
It's interesting to me. It's interesting. They get something out of it, right? They get something out of deconstructing people, and I think they consider it a virtue on some level, and I don't think they're thinking much deeper than how they feel about it. I wanted to turn the conversation back to online bullying here, and we talked briefly about the fact that, you know, there's a few different types of people that engage in the bullying, and the kids that do it are trying to find boundaries or that don't exist. Now, those boundaries don't exist in part because of the anonymity, right? Do you think people are more apt to commit an act of violence when they're hidden in the crowd as opposed to face with the victim? And if that's so, if anonymity is a cause or a catalyst for some of this violence, what do you think a solution to that could be for social media? You know, considering rights to privacy and stuff like that.
I think I think it's a question that, you know, clearly a lot of people are grappling with, and I don't really have any surefire answers to that right now. I definitely noticed that people, when there's an anonymity, anonymity implies that you're not going to get caught, so you're less likely, you know, it's more cowardly as well, and so you've got that element to just like looking at it not from what can a Google or a Facebook, etc., do to help with this, but I'm just saying in general that's what's going on internally with the bullies. You know, that is, but I don't know. I think one thing that I do know is I don't want the government deciding
For sure.
unless there's an infringement of actual rights going on. But I believe that the 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 companies will be able to come up with a solution much better than Congress will.
Well,
Or
I know on the new social media app Parlor, if you get verified, you have to have a valid form of ID. You take a picture with that valid form of ID. You give them information that's linked to that ID, and you become a sort of verified user. Um, and I think one of the problems with something like Twitter, or some of these other accounts, is if somebody's using an account to slander or libel somebody, and they get blocked because an algorithm happens to pick them up, or somebody happens to complain about them and they get suspended for a time, they just re-enter the system, right, under a different identity, because there's no identity linked to them, a different handle, and they continue to do what they do. They
yeah,
continue to
sure.
spread the maliciousness. But if their accounts were linked to an identification and or somebody who has financial responsibility for them, if they're a kid, then they could not re-enter the system after being suspended for their maliciousness without being seen and tagged, and perhaps warned that libel and slander are punishable. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
perhaps there's a way the company institutes tying their identities to their accounts in a way that they just can't re-enter the system at any old time and continue what they're doing, and that would be a form of consequence. What do you think of that?
well, I think practically, I think that that could definitely happen because look at Airbnb and services like that. You have to, you know, I know that when I signed up my account for Airbnb, I had to provide my driver's license and that, and it, you know, there was a method of getting verified so that um, what would you call hosts know that I'm not just some random and anonymized person who may or may not turn up. You know, there's an element of responsibility there, and I think maybe you're onto something there. I think that the it has to be well defined what was the responsibility of the parent within that with the kids and certain ages, and I think that that all has to be would have to be um, well defined.
I think so too. Now, I say this because I think the social media platforms are using algorithms that are singling out people who are ideologically different, not necessarily violent, but it's using the social justice template as a means of deciphering who's good and who's bad, and that's of course redounding very badly for one side of the political spectrum, and I think that that has to be undone. But I also think that teenagers are also being exploited and used by companies and or political entities to spread maliciousness, and this linking them to a legitimate identification, including a parent who should be responsible for what their kids are doing online. Uh, I think would be one way of increasing parental responsibility by virtue of the fact that their pocketbooks and their life savings are on the line if their kids are libeling and slandering somebody. I say this because in February, I was attacked by a horde of teenagers. Now, these kids are extremely sophisticated on social media, and they spread lies about you based on clipped tweets. They create an entire narrative that's unfortunately very much centered around the social justice theme. They spread that and link your employers, your actors, your friends, and other social media influencers into the mix, and oftentimes get these people get these people involved and engaged in an argument where, for example, my reputation is on the line, but the social influencer doesn't know that. He's just joining into the fight because he's perceiving their narrative as the truth. Now, that is extremely damaging. And when your fans pile on to defend you, they're almost like sociopaths in that they revert to victimhood. They close down their account temporarily, then say that they're being harassed. They claim that there's death threats. They're all lies, most of them, and then that they need apologies. That you're horrible for attacking teenagers and fighting with them, even though they sort of initiated the process. And these kids need to be dealt with. Their parents need to be held accountable for what they're doing online, because it is hellaciously criminal. Yeah. And so I think the ID is one way a social media company can take responsibility and hold these people accountable.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there that I mean, that sounds terrifying, and
it's awful.
It's something, you know, that I think as objectivism expands and becomes bigger and more influential, it's something that maybe we're all going to have to be trained in to expect at some point, because I don't think we're big enough yet to, in general, have that kind of attention. But you also mentioned something there that's something I didn't mention earlier, is that there's another element in there that's much smaller, but that there are sociopaths in the mix as well. So I think, you know, when the kids are pushing those boundaries, most kids go, "Oh God, I'm sorry," and they learn from it, and they feel shame, and they have that capacity to empathize. And then there are some people out there who are sociopaths. They have no capacity for empathy whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole debate there, like, is that purely genetic and environmental? And and that's not something we've got time to go into now, but I think it is an objective fact. There are sociopaths out there, and so they will get that pleasure from taking someone down and destroying someone, and you have to sort of mitigate for that as well in the mix. I think most kids are okay, you know, and in the mix there's some sociopaths, and in the mix is also bad philosophy. So you've got all those elements going on.
Yeah, I think that you through the two or three waves of attacks that I've experienced on social media, the vast majority are following along and want to be popular and want to be a part of the crowd that seems powerful to them, and they want followers and fame. Some of them think they're getting famous by attacking somebody who's a celebrity. And then there's the handful. There's the 3, 4, or 5 individuals that you can pick out of a lot that are really, really twisted. Really twisted. And they're the puppet. They're the puppet masters that are pulling the strings, and you can tell they like it.
Yeah. And
so,
yeah, well, I'm sorry to hear that you went through that, and I'm hoping that we can use your experience down the line in building resilience, and the fact that hopefully our self-esteem can withstand an attack like that as well.
Well, I think I'm starting a project called the Guardian Project with a business partner, and it came out of a spontaneous sort of group that formed around me to defend my reputation. But I think that this could be universalized and be very helpful on social media. And we've got some irons in the fire that I think could change the dynamic of the conversation soon.
Oh, that's fantastic. Can you just repeat the name of that?
It's called the Guardian Project now.
The Guardian Project.
Follow it on Facebook. Yeah, you can follow it on Facebook and at the Raw Nerve as well.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's a perfect point for us to end today. You know, we've gone over time. Always seem to go over time. Apologize for that. But the Guardian Project. There's light at the end of this tunnel today. There we go.
Yes.
We've got some solutions and some ways forward through this wild west of social media. We're still an element of that going on at the moment. So thanks very much, Mark, for your insight and what you brought today. And
Thank you.
just to let those of you who are um, interested, later on tonight, starting at 7 p.m. UK time on this page, we'll be live streaming. Nikos will be here. He's talking on environmentalism, the hidden history and philosophy. So for those of you who want to seek more and understand the environmentalist movements, maybe some of you have never even begun to look at that yet. I really recommend tune in at 7 p.m. tonight on this page. And once again, thanks very much, Mark, for joining us today. And
Thank you.
we'll be back on the Daily Objective tomorrow, 6 p.m., same place. Looking forward to seeing you then. Thanks very much.